Welcome to the Some Insights podcast.
SoMe stands for social media.
I'm Dante Licona, an independent social media strategist.
And I'm Matthias Lufkens, founder of Digitips.
In this podcast, we talk to the people who manage social media accounts for organizations and their executives, and sometimes executives themselves. They all have interesting stories to tell.
The idea is to learn how they're managing accounts, how executives engage on each platform, and hear their tips and tricks. We want to learn from the best cases of social media usage.
Today, we are honored to have with us Toily Kurbanov, the Executive Coordinator of United Nations Volunteers. Welcome, Toily, and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Toily, you are present on most social media platforms, from Facebook to Instagram and X to TikTok. Which is your preferred social media platform and why?
Well, I prefer different social media platforms for different reasons. One of my preferred social media is Odnoklassniki, which is the way for me to get connected with my classmates in high school and college back home. I prefer X or Twitter to stay in touch with what's happening in the humanitarian development community, what's happening in the UN universe within that community as well. And I prefer LinkedIn to keep the finger on the pulse on what's happening in the world of work. What are the trends for unemployment, on the skill set development, skill requirements, etc.
And now that you mentioned LinkedIn, you have 12,000 followers there. You're part of the Top Voices program. Can you share with us how you got that distinction and how important is personal social media engagement for leaders like you?
I'm still puzzled myself, to be honest, how I got that Top Voice distinction. I was kindly offered by a LinkedIn team for Europe. Obviously, they've been doing surveillance of my LinkedIn presence over a period of time. And since UNV overall is quite present on LinkedIn, United Nations Volunteers being a rather small entity in the UN, we seem to be punching above our weight. UNV is one of the most attractive brands, quote unquote, on LinkedIn. So perhaps that was the background story behind getting the Top Voice. At least that's the way I rationalize it. Other than that, I don't have any distinction, no claim for the Top Voice.
How important is personal social media engagement for leaders?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I can speak for myself, and of course, at risk of generalizing a bit. Again, since I represent United Nations Volunteer in my current function, and UNV is quite people-centered organization, it's all about people, and so it comes very natural to us that we're big on the social media. And for me personally, in my current role, social media is a way to keep finger on the pulse. When it comes to the world of work, then I just don't see how you can do it efficiently and effectively without getting engaged on LinkedIn. And in terms of the news and the happenings in the international development humanitarian community, the way of keeping the finger on the pulse right now seems to be mostly through X and Twitter, with ups and downs. And overall, that's an excellent shortcut into the keeping finger on the pulse. And also, it's the way of portraying certain values or certain ambitions. Conveying messages, as we say, slipping into the jargon a bit. Apologies for that, but that's also an efficient way of doing. Would be through the social media.
What are the key challenges for executives like you who are using social media personally?
I think, in as much as social media presence is about instant interactions. Again, a bit of overgeneralizing there. But most of the social media interactions from LinkedIn to X Twitter to Instagram is about the instant interactions. And from that comes the first challenge, perhaps the foremost challenge for me at least, is how to differentiate or identify what is the background noise and what are the real stories. And it's not necessarily obvious on a day-to-day basis to make that distinction. I think it's through the continuous engagement of the social media platforms rather, that one would be able to draw conclusions as to what is the background noise and what really important matters that are forming today's discourse, whether it's humanitarian development work or the world of the work. So I just would conclude that this is the one, and the first and the foremost challenge, to me at least, to distinguish between the background noise and the real important storylines.
Do you have a main goal for your personal social media engagement?
It's to contribute to the work of the United Nations, and within that, to the work of the United Nations volunteers. I can speak a bit more about my work in the UNV, and as a function of that, my presence in the social media. I often see myself as a self-appointed chief communications officer of UNV. There are expectations that the head of UNV would be present almost in the social media and would use that presence to convey the main storylines about the work of the UNV. So that's the goal, to be a good brand ambassador for the United Nations volunteers as much as I can.
Some of your colleagues are not on social media. What advice would you give your peers who are still hesitating to use social media personally?
If you manage to stay away of the social media in 2024, you're doing very well. Maybe you don't need to be on the social media. I think there may be very few examples of those executives and any manager in the UN. If they're still offline, as it were, then maybe they don't need to get online. They're doing pretty fine.
Would you consider using an institutional personal account, such as Volunteer Chief? There's the @UNICEF Chief, or a branded account such as your predecessor, Olivier Adam, UNV. And why not? Because you have your personal name, Toily Korbanov, as your handle on social media.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I thought, Matthias, about that a bit. And I wasn't sure what's the problem that it will fix. As they say, why fix something that's not broken? I could see a possible downside in that the branding of self on the social media, the way that you have suggested, or given a couple of examples, might actually depersonalize a bit the social media engagement. And since people know me as Toily Korbanov, that's fine. I will be communicating as Toily Korbanov.
Is there a social media moment you are most proud of?
Social media is about the instant interaction. So any moment that I'm disappointed or proud of would probably go back to this morning's breakfast, the social media connection that they had, or just some post a couple of weeks ago. The one that I thought was on my side, one contribution that I thought was important for me to make was to present an average archetype of the United Nations, of a United Nations volunteer today. And having had the stats at my fingertips of who are the United Nations volunteers around the globe, and having DAL-E just few keystrokes away, I pulled up a portrait of an average UN volunteer today, which happens to be a woman from the global south. And that communication had resonated a bit, it seems, with the global public through different social media platforms.
I think one post which resonated very well was when you took over the job as United Nations Volunteers head, and you were actually, I think you were on a motorcycle with your predecessor and taking a selfie while he was at the wheel, and you were basically taking the position. That got quite a bit of engagement.
Yeah. Except it wasn't a selfie. The German road police would have not allowed us to take a selfie being on the motorbike. I think those were the paparazzi out there who had then graciously shared the photo with us.
Toily, you briefly mentioned the use already of artificial intelligence tools. How do you see the opportunities going forward for using these tools for your social media communication?
Really, Dante, it's such a big question. I just wouldn't, want to pretend that I can make informed and I have informed reflections about that. I think that's a rapidly evolving landscape, rapidly evolving field. There are some almost conventional wisdoms about the use of the artificial intelligence, in that it will unlock humans' creativity, allow to artificial intelligence to go about the more routine, even if the routine tasks are analytical, but more routine analytical tasks. But is yet to be seen. I think it's once the story that comes to my mind is the Zhou Enlai, who was the premier in China in the 60s and the 70s, was once asked, what does the Chinese Politburo think about the influence of the Great French Revolution on the Great Chinese Revolution? To which Zhou Enlai had said, "We think it's too early to draw conclusions." So if it was too early to draw conclusions after 200 years, I wouldn't pretend that we can say much more about artificial intelligence.
Because I've seen your posts, they have quite a lot of insights and a lot of historical references, like the one you mentioned. How much time would you invest in creating some of your posts?
The creation as an act of pressing keystrokes and adding picture does not take a lot of time. The transaction itself is over seconds. Conceiving what would be, or reflecting what would be an interesting post takes a lot more time. And that's not necessarily something that one keeps thinking about all the time. In our lines of work, we often, go about our work, and there are some recurrent themes that we go back to every now and then you think, oh, maybe I should post a photo or an image of an average UN volunteer. So it's really hard to come up with a definitive assessment. But the transaction itself, the posting, is usually a short act.
Well, we got to the moment where we get to the final battery of standard questions that we ask all our guests. So the first one is, who is your favorite and most inspiring social media mentor?
I think one person who definitely made a huge impact on how I relate to the social media is the former Prime Minister of New Zealand and the former administrator of UNDP, Helen Clark. I spent more than a decade with the United Nations Development Program, including a few years when she was at the helm of the organization. And in my humble opinion, she's the one who took today's X, back then Twitter's presence to the next level for the UN executives. I learned quite a bit from her and how she used her social media presence and lended her social media audience to amplify the voice of UNDP country offices. And that to me was the most important takeaway that I carry with me. And that's actually one of the objectives of my social media presence too, to make sure that other colleagues in UNDP or in the UN who would not be necessarily heard if they speak on their own are getting an audience that they deserve, to lend my networks, my connections, to amplify those voices.
Following up on that, which are your 3 favorite accounts to follow?
Elon Musk, as the sort of daily provocations. No, but seriously, I think in the on LinkedIn there are quite a lot of sources that are and the channels and the personalities that broadcast interesting messages day in and day out. I mean, very difficult for me to single out any one of them. I think the work that you're doing is very interesting. So that's one account to follow on LinkedIn, or 2 accounts in this case. On X and Twitter, there are a few that I find interesting because they kind of related to the work that I do, and yet they have an institutional autonomy, independence. One of them is Past Blue on X and Twitter. That's a publication that covers what's happening inside the UN and around the UN. The other one that is quite similar in terms of their proximity to the UN and at the same time independence is the SC procedure, the Security Council procedure, which is run by one of our retired staff in the Secretariat with a lot of institutional knowledge and a lot of the history insights on how the organization is going about conducting its daily business. And of course, there are so many others that I find useful following, especially when you set up on X and Twitter the lists. So I find I have my own list of UNDP field units, which is the UNDP colleagues around the world, which is the first list I open every morning when I have a connection to internet. I have the list of UN humanitarian coordinators, which is also very interesting because most of these colleagues are at the front line of the humanitarian action, and you get immediate reflection of what's happening or what happened overnight. I have a list of UNDP senior management, United Nations Development Program, because in UNDP, they reflect not so much of what's happening in response to the humanitarian crisis, but even more as to what are the underlying conditions of the crisis and what could be the long-term measures that need to be considered to deal with the crisis at the root cause levels. So these are just few, spontaneously.
Is there any podcast that you are currently listening to?
I think yours will be the first one, Dante.
Well, that's great to hear. That's great for us.
Do you ever disconnect, and how do you avoid social media burnout?
Well, believe it or not, I do my work mostly through the meetings and the field trips.
Yeah.
So that's 90% of my time. And I think I've never thought of it this way. You are always almost always plugged in, and at the same time, it just happens somewhere in the background. I haven't thought of it this way. I haven't really ever differentiated and really assessed how much time I spent on the social media. But most of my work is offline.
And finally, in one sentence, what is your social media mantra?
No fluff in social media and elsewhere.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tolly Kurbanov. Thank you for your time and those amazing tips that you've shared with us. Thanks for joining this episode of our SOMI podcast with me, Matthias Lufkens.
And me, Dante Licone. Please subscribe and follow us on our accounts. See you next time.
Thank you very much, colleagues.